On a bitterly cold March night in 1770, tension reached a breaking point on the snow-covered streets of Boston. British soldiers, stationed to enforce the Crown's laws, found themselves face to face with an angry mob of colonists, armed with nothing more than snowballs, sticks, and raw fury. Outside the old customs house, what began as a protest against British rule would soon erupt into violence forever etched into history as the Boston Massacre. This was not just the clash of soldiers and citizens, but the spark of a revolution brewing in the heart of America.
Steady now, lads. This unruly mob look angrier than a hornet's nest, and they're not here to talk.
Let's go back to the story of the Boston Massacre in 1770. So, when British troops landed in Boston, Parliament and the King probably expected the colonists to calm down, right? Like, okay, we'll just park some soldiers here and that'll keep things in check. Spoiler alert, it did not. Instead of scaring people off, the presence of these redcoats only cranked up the tension. As these soldiers stood outside the customs house, the locals didn't shy away. Oh no, they'd walk by, hurl insults like, "Hey, lobster back." That's right, because of those fancy red uniforms. They probably threw in a "hey jerk" or two for good measure, though I'm not sure jerk was in the colonial vocabulary. And this is a family-friendly story. Sorry, we'll keep the colorful words aside that I'm sure they truly said, but seriously, lobsterback was a favorite. Picture this, soldiers just trying to do their job, escorting the tax collectors, and colonists would walk by, heckling them. Definitely not what the British government had in mind. The protests kept growing through 1768, got even worse in 1769, and by 1770, things were really heating up. In early 1770, a group of soldiers was stationed at the customs house, their job being to protect the money collected from taxes, because, tax money was important to the British, even if it was causing all this drama. These young redcoats, just doing their job, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a mob, and this wasn't just a few angry folks, we're talking hundreds of protesters. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The soldiers were just kids, like 18, 19 years old. Most of them had joined the British Army for a paycheck, and boom, they get shipped off to Boston. To these guys, Boston wasn't just any city. It had this rep as a place full of religious fanatics. Puritans, right? It probably felt like they were being sent to live in a place where people were still getting scolded for not wearing enough black. So it's March 1770, and these soldiers are standing there already on edge from the daily insults being hurled at them. On this particular day, it goes from words to snowballs, and not the fun, fluffy kind. Colonists start wrapping rocks inside the snow and lobbing them at the soldiers. Then it escalates to just straight up rocks. At one point, a soldier gets hit in the head by a rock, blood pouring from his head wound, and he collapses. Now remember, these are young men surrounded by a massive crowd. Hundreds of people shouting at them, throwing things. At this point, the situation is getting real intense. Imagine being a 19-year-old redcoat halfway across the world, getting pelted by snow-covered rocks and hearing people in the crowd shout things like, "Fire! Go ahead! Fire at us!" What do? Well, these soldiers, already feeling trapped, decided to do exactly that. They opened fire on the crowd. Now, before you judge them too harshly, put yourself in their shoes. They're outnumbered. They've just seen one of their own knocked down by a rock, and they legitimately feared for their lives. When they fired, they ended up killing 5 colonists. And with that, the so-called Boston Massacre was born. You might be thinking, wait, 5 people? Isn't that more of a skirmish than a massacre? Well, leave it to the colonial press to put a spin on things. The media in Boston jumped on the term massacre. Like CNN comparing January 6 to 9/11, it was breaking news. They made it clear, look, these British soldiers are killing your neighbors now. This isn't just about taxes anymore. Your government is straight up murdering people. So yeah, things just got very real in 1770. Up until then, it had been boycotts, protests, and some tarring and feathering, which was more of an extreme prank, really. But now there were actual casualties. The Boston Massacre marked a turning point. This wasn't just colonial grumbling about taxes anymore. This was blood on the streets. The events of the Boston Massacre sent shockwaves through the colonies, fueling outrage and deepening the divide between Britain and its American subjects. What began as a deadly confrontation on a cold March night became a rallying cry for liberty, igniting the colonists' resolve for independence. This tragedy was more than a flashpoint, it was a step toward revolution, as the desire for freedom grew stronger with each passing day. Watch the entirety of this story in Part 4 of the America Begins series.
In the dawn's early light, our flags were sown with might. From the hills we took our stand, in this untamed promised land. With the drum beats in our hearts, we chased away the dark.